This past September, I had the joy of attending the release of my friend and YouTube colleague Andy of Attaché Films' movie The Sudbury Devil over in Salem, Massachusetts. It's a really fantastic film. Just FYI, it's really historically accurate and equally completely raucous in that totally wonderful 80s horror way that more modern horror films would benefit from. But one of the questions that I got that weekend is if I had ever covered the Salem Witch Trials here at Esoterica. And the answer was basically no, for the simple reason that the topic has been so well covered by basically everything else that I wouldn't even consider it esoterica at this point. But that weekend in Salem, I also had the chance to get away from the witchy hustle bustle of Essex Street and make my way over to Danvers, where the archaeological remains of the Parris parsonage still remain. And the Danvers Asylum, which is now condos. By the way, that was Lovecraft's exemplar for Arkham Asylum, now late of Batman lore. But, and I have to say, it made quite an impression on me. The ruins, that is. Not the condos made from an insane asylum. Who would live there? I spent the better part of an hour there, alone, tucked away behind some houses in Danvers, sitting in the ruined basement, in the very home where the local physician William Greggs declared that Abigail Williams and Betty Parris were both, quote, under an evil hand. That diagnosis would unleash a storm of witchcraft, as it's called, upon the already highly dysfunctional community of Salem, and silently meditating among the ruins of history on the events of February 1692 to May of 1693, two questions sprung to my mind. The first is what happened to those souls gathered together in that home I was sitting in, ostensibly, where witchcraft and diabolism were first ominously pronounced. What became of Tituba and her husband, John Indian, both enslaved people, to Abigail and Betty, both girls of only 11 or 12 and 9 years of age, respectively, when all of that broke out, when they were all caught in the eye of the horrible storm of witchcraft, the lack of social agency, and yet themselves, they unleashed a lethal chain reaction in the community. Further, I became equally interested in the most inhuman mechanism beneath that lethal chain reaction. Upon what was the juridical process of that very lethality based? What legal, religious, and demonological logic was at work in those murderous proceedings at Salem? Interestingly enough, the answer there is a relatively obscure work on witchcraft detection and prosecution published by the Puritan Richard Bernard with the frankly undertitled, typical of those Puritans, the understated title of simply A Guide to Grand Jurymen. As we do this time of the year, let's turn back to colonial North America and explore a couple of more obscure details of the Salem Witch Trials, which I imagine many of you are quite expert in. But if you're interested in magic, hermetic philosophy, alchemy, Kabbalah, or the academic study of the occult, I hope you subscribe here to Esoterica and check out my other contents and topics on esotericism, including curated playlists. And also, if you want to support this work of providing accessible, scholarly, and importantly, free content on topics in esotericism here on YouTube, again, I'd hope you consider supporting my work over at my Patreon. You can use a one-time donation with PayPal. You can use the super thanks option below the video. You can pick up some cool black metal style merch over on the channel store. I even have a complete collection of rare antiquarian occult volumes for sale as part of my fall catalog, so check that out as well. But now, on to what has become a blockbuster event of American demonology, the Salem Witch Trials. I'm Justin Sledge, and welcome to Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion. As I mentioned in the introduction, this episode is definitely not going to be an introduction to the Salem Witch Trials. There are dozens, hundreds of perfectly good documentaries on YouTube, the History Channel. You shouldn't trust the ones on the History Channel. All of that do that just fine, and well enough, you can check out Emerson Baker's The Storm of Witchcraft, which is, I think at this point, the definitive history of the trials, along with a host of primary source documents that you can view mostly online. The Salem Witch Trials are so well trod that I dare say they're not really esoterica anymore. Not to say there aren't important and obscure witchcraft elements in colonial America. I've actually covered the host of other colonial witch trials, especially those in colonial Connecticut, that actually predate the Salem trials by several years. You can check out that episode in the card above. In fact, I have a whole series on the occult in colonial America that I do this time of the year because American Thanksgiving, I suppose. You can check out that playlist as well. However, this episode is going to explore two interesting at least to me, but somewhat frankly unrelated questions, although as we'll see as we sort of untie these, we'll realize they're actually quite bound together in the end. The first is the fate of those at the ground zero of the chain reaction: Abigail Williams, Betty, Parris, and Tituba. What ultimately happened to these people? The second question I'll be taking a look at is an exploration of the very demonological manual that was primarily used by the judges in the Salem Witch Trials that led to judicial mass murder, because that's what we do around here. We look at very small books that lead to mass murder somehow. Typically of most moral panics, the disastrous aftermath of this panic at Salem was the subject of near complete immediate amnesia after it was over. You know, when you do dreadful things, you like to forget about it. So much so in Salem, the site where the hangings actually happened was basically forgotten about until just recently. Archaeologists just discovered where it was, if you could believe that. But, as a refresher, the chain reaction that ultimately set off the trials started in the home of the Salem village minister Samuel Parris. In early 1692, Parris's daughter Elizabeth, known as Betty, age 9, and his maybe niece meant a lot of things back then, an orphan, she was an orphan, Abigail Williams, aged 11 or so, began to experience strange fits, primarily marked by odd bodily contortions and complaints of being pinched and pricked by pins. What caused these initial outbursts isn't clear at all. However, the theory of ergotism, a condition brought on by the consumption of a fungus-infested rye, first forwarded by Linda Caporal in April of 1976, an edition of Science, no less, that's been widely debunked. Now, you wouldn't believe that if you read YouTube comments, but no one accepts the ergotism theory anymore. It's just the symptomology doesn't line up. The involvement also of any occult practices is also pretty doubtful in this case, though there is some suggestion of future husband divination using eggs in the Parris household that may have happened that previous winter, but this was sort of just ubiquitous through the colonies. However, the evidence is pretty scant and seems a bit odd for me. I mean, those girls were pretty young to be looking for husbands, but I guess it was the 1690s. Ugh. Also, similar bedevilment had also been widely reported in Boston in 1688, and it's likely the Parris girls would have known about that and could have been consciously or unconsciously imitating those conditions. Regardless, their situation deteriorated despite prayer and fasting, the frankly typical, the only Puritan cure for such apparent demonic infestations. They didn't have relics and all that popery stuff. That the new minister, Parris, actually brought on the new local physician, William Greggs, who diagnosed the girls as, quote, under an evil hand on February the 24th. That diagnosis of bewitchment by a physician, a learned physician, is going to prove incredibly important. So hold on to that thread. Was basically a diagnosis of bewitchment. A local neighbor, Mary Sibley, intervened the very next day, unbeknownst to Samuel Parris, who I think was out of town. She instructed and worked with Tituba and her husband, John Indian, both enslaved people belonging to Parris, to create a witch cake to stop the demonic inflictions. Now, a lot has been made about the potential role of Tituba in all this, mostly real racist 19th century stuff. However, there is no evidence that Tituba ever exposed the girls to anything related to the occult in any form. Even the witch cake is a traditional European, even specifically insular anti-witchcraft measure, whereby the afflicted person's urine is gathered with flour, typically rye flour. A cake is prepared and, in this case, fed to a dog. The idea being that the chomping of the dog, or in the case of the witch bottle, a similar technology where the urine of the afflicted is sealed with pins and needles and sometimes boiled, would cause agony upon the witch causing this bewitchment, thus outing them so that steps could be taken to stop the affliction and kill the witch. Again, the use of witch cakes is of insular origin. It's not Caribbean or hoodoo or voodooing, and it was Mary Sibley's idea, not Tituba's. That's not to say that Tituba didn't have access to anti-witchcraft technology from her own indigenous culture. Tituba, as far as we can tell, was native to the Caribbean or perhaps Southern American indigenous peoples, but it was eventually acquired by Parris in Barbados after he inherited an estate down there. Though she did confess to learning about the occult from her previous owneress, the lady who owned her before. But again, there's no evidence to suggest an occult link by Tituba to what's happening to these young girls, despite, again, a lot of hideous 19th century depictions of Tituba. Further, while Tituba does eventually confess to herself being tortured by several witches, namely Sarah Good, who would be hanged, and Sarah Osborne, who would die in the horrifying prison conditions there at Salem, it's important to note that she also testified that her confessions were only made after she was beaten by Minister Parris, because that's a good Christian thing to do, to beat your slave into confessing witchcraft. So confession basically arrived at the torture of an enslaved person. In an even more horrible, ironic twist, the very marks left by those beatings were also used and declared to be witch marks left by the devil, and thus evidence of Tituba being in league with the devil, to use the technical language of that time. Now, by that time, Abigail and Betty also began blaming Tituba for their afflictions, and about a mile away in either direction, Ann Putnam Jr. and Elizabeth Hubbard both became afflicted with something very similar happening to Abigail Williams and Betty Parris. Elizabeth Hubbard is very key in all of this because she was 17, and that allowed her to testify openly in court, which she did 32 times during the course of the panic. On February 29th, Tituba, Sarah Good, and Sarah Osborne were all arrested, and by March, the machine of death and murder was unleashed upon the area. Now, as I mentioned, Good and Osborne would both be murdered by hanging and by horrible prison conditions in the events that followed. But Tituba, interestingly enough, would survive. So what became of her? She would testify in several depositions on different occasions, often with incredibly leading questions, to which she was frankly resistant at times and then quite happy to, make things up. It was also testified that she appeared in spectral form to torment various people, but only by pinching them and pricking them with pins. And despite having confessed to signing a contract with the devil, the core of the witchcraft beliefs of that time, Tituba was never indicted, convicted, much less subject to any corporal or capital punishment, barring that being beaten into confessing. Why? You'd expect, given the times, especially given her status as a native enslaved person and thus a true other of the community, that her fate would have basically been sealed upon arrest and confession. How did Tituba survive? Well, the answer is it's real complicated and we don't really know. The first element was that, she'd already really survived a horrific ordeal, being subject to the death penalty for over a year in a positively dreadful circumstance, and her 13 months in prison, a prison so horrible in its conditions that at least 5 people died there during the panic, must have just itself been a nightmare. You're just in a dungeon watching people die all around you. That she survived just being imprisoned is testimony to her fortitude. But having just survived that long had the effect that the panic itself was already coming to an end, and that those confessions, especially dubious confessions that were increasingly subject to doubt, that along with the spectral evidence or the rejection of spectral evidence evidence arrived at in dreams or in states of diabolical ensnarement meant that basically all the evidence against Tituba was simply became inadmissible by April and May of 1693 when they stopped being completely insane. In fact, when the case finally went before the grand jury in May of 1693, elements of her confession were mentioned. They did in fact include the fact that she mentioned signing the devil's book with a C-shaped mark, but the indictment was returned ignoramus. Now, I've seen different books actually claim that she wasn't formally indicted because the ignoramus verdict means that she was declared to be something like diminished capacity in modern legal parlance, but that just isn't true. This literature just doesn't understand how this stuff worked. Ignoramus in Latin just means we don't know, and it just indicates that there was no indictment for lack of evidence. They failed to indict her because the evidence against her was either insufficient or suspect or both. Or they were coming to their senses and they realized that all that other evidence they'd used to kill all those other women and press Giles Corey to death, maybe that was also not so great evidence. But, Tituba. Further, it's possible that her early confession spared her in that the Puritan judges basically wanted to use her to set an example. You confess early, we'll have mercy on you. Further, she was also instrumental as kind of the patient zero of the diabolism, thus keeping her alive was also likely instrumental in achieving future convictions. So she kind of worked in two different ways for the judges. You show that you're merciful and you make use of her when you can use her. Though despite her indictment ultimately being dropped, her ordeal wasn't over. Her 13 months in prison had racked up a £7 fee, which was a lot back then. Prisoners were required to provide their own meals, clothing, and supplies. That's why she racked up this fee, which had to be paid by Samuel Parris, her owner, before her release. He balked. £7 was about half the value as an enslaved person, and the scandal was probably such that he just wanted nothing to do with her. However, it appears that she was basically purchased. When someone paid the £7 fee, they basically got a domestic slave for half off, and Tituba simply vanishes from the historical record. Thus, at least Tituba survived. Though, again, as hideously as it is sad, through 13 months of a horrifying ordeal in prison, and then just to be passed from one owner to another, the horrifying early moments of enslavement in this country. What about Abigail Williams and Betty Parris? Neither were really old enough to be in much real danger, frankly, though both did lethal harm. The fate of Abigail Williams is frankly the most obscure. She would appear before the court on June 30th of 1692, and then promptly disappear from history. Poof. No records of her afterwards have ever been found, though many, many legends remain. In fact, I was reading an article online somewhere about Abigail Williams, and it actually said that she was eventually moved out to trapping grounds in Mackinac Island, retired, lived, and buried there on Mackinac Island here in Michigan, about 4 or 5 hours away. I was a little bit suspicious of this, and I checked the source for this information, and sure enough, no citation for that existed. I even reached out to the Mackinac Island Historical Society to see if there's any evidence for this claim, which I've now seen on several websites and shows up from time to time on Wikipedia as well, and I'll comment if they ever get back to me about the final destiny of Abigail Williams on Mackinac Island, which would be quite a tourist attraction, I guess. Marilyn Roach's Day-to-Day Chronicle also notes that Abigail died, quote, haunted to the end in Salem, quote, before the end of 1697, around the age of 17, but she also provides no documentary evidence or further citations. So far as I can tell, Abigail Williams simply became a memory after June of 1692, though there is a fantastic black metal band named after her, Abigail Williams, one of my favorite black metal records, Becoming. It's actually by Abigail Williams, so she lives on in black metal. Betty Parris's fate is a bit more germane. Her father had her sent away to live with the Sewell family as the witch panic intensified through 1692. While her symptoms briefly persisted through that year, they would eventually subside by 1693. She got better. She would reappear in the historical record only in 1710 when she married Benjamin Barron around the age of 27. Her father was still supporting her at that time, actually helping to furnish her home there in the Concord-Sudbury area, and she would go on to live a pretty quiet life, having 4 children in the Sudbury-Concord area, dying and then buried on March the 21st, 1760, there in Concord, Massachusetts, aged 77. So she lived quite a while. While the gravestone of her mother survives, Betty, who they're both named Elizabeth, Betty's has long since disappeared. To my knowledge, she never acknowledged, nor discussed, nor apologized for her role in the Salem Witch Panic, though, again, she was only 9 years old during those terrible events, and surely her subsequent life lived under Salem's shadow. Under Salem's shadow. Band name alert. Thus, despite the state murder of 19, the murder by judicial torture of Giles Corey, the homicidal prison conditions which killed at least 5 people, along with a host of other social, financial, psychological, and spiritual hardships brought on by the Salem Witch Trials, these 3 people, 2 girls and 1 woman, at the very ground zero of the panic, they all managed to survive. And I frankly think that's rather interesting. But between the first signs of diabolism in the Parris household and through the last executions through 1693, what was the actual legal mechanism that drove the panic? Now, I know this sounds very boring, but it'll get more interesting. In a nutshell, it was the English grand jury system, though specifically informed by an otherwise obscure little pamphlet published in 2 editions in 1627 and 1629, by the prolific Puritan Richard Bernard, simply entitled A Guide to Grand Jurymen. This was born out of the rapid increase after 1604 of the Witchcraft Act of James I. The guide is a slightly ironic candidate for mass murder that erupted over there in Salem. As you might recall from my episode on James I and 6 text on witchcraft, the Demonology, his administration was, let's call it, completely relentless in witch hunting, and featured such witch finder generals as Matthew Hopkins, himself responsible for around 300 murders in the 1640s. He was about as lethal with his buddies as like a Einsatzgruppen. However, following this uptick in the killings, a more moderated tone settled in, such that volumes like Bernard's Guide were seen as more even-handed among witchcraft persecution documents. The Puritans, say what you like, were people who thought of themselves as coming down on the side of reason and restraint, after all, and in many ways that's frankly true. Thus, the guide was actually written for grand jurors presiding over witchcraft cases precisely in the interest of pumping the brakes on assuming that all misfortunes should all be attributed to witchcraft. It's just not the case that everything that's bad happens to you is witchcraft. And as such, the first section of the book is much concerned with grand jurors doing their best to rule out witchcraft with a range of natural explanations offered. It's meant to get rid of the idea that witchcraft is operating. Not that he denies that it's happening. Specifically, the various signs of diabolism should be inspected by a learned physician, such that any specific natural disease, from a physical disease or a mental disease like melancholy, a historic term for mental illness, could all be ruled out. Then, and only then, could an investigation into diabolism and thus witchcraft actually begin. Recall, that's exactly what happened in the Parris household. Abigail and Betty's condition was eventually ruled to be under an evil hand by the local doctor, William Griggs. Now, whether Griggs knew this or not, that diagnosis probably did more to kickstart the panic, because it was there that the bewitchings happened to be going on. Well, someone must be doing the bewitching. First, Tituba was caught in the blame cycle, although she confessed rapidly, probably saving her life, which was then extended to Sarah Good and Sarah Osborne, both women who marginalized in that community. from which the general conflagration took hold. In fact, without such a physician's clear diagnosis, any other symptoms submitted to a grand jury as evidence for a diabolism should, according to the guide, be discounted, and such an indictment should be returned as ignoramus. That's exactly what would eventually happen to Tituba. They're following this text very closely there in Salem. While the Parris girls may have been bewitched, no such evidence from a physician was ever produced for Tituba, and her confession, again arrived at through coercive beatings by Parris, had to likewise be vacated. When they're getting their ground over in Salem and they're following some of the logic of things like the Guide to Grand Jurymen, they're actually much more lenient and process heavy. While the guide is no malleus maleficarum, it is surprisingly learned and moderate, frankly. It's a moderate take on the process of witchcraft persecution. For instance, it actually argues against the ordeal of swimming witches as impudently demanding a miracle from God. There were no ordeals performed in Salem. No witches were swam in Salem, I think, on the weight of a text like this, for what it's worth. It's even a bit ecumenical in some ways, in that Bernard does his Puritan duty of course, deriding Catholic superstition and papistry at every chance he gets. There are no fancy exorcisms, relics, or rituals at use here, just good old prayer and fasting against the devil. But the guide relies heavily on the Jesuit Del Rio's 1599 investigations into magic for most of the grand juryman's demonology. So he'll deride the Catholics, but he leans on them pretty hard. Of course, it rejects the radical, skeptical positions that were making ground at the time. The text actually does name and dismiss the books of people like Johann Weyer and Reginald Scott, who dismissed the witchcraft as basically killing a bunch of poor women with mental illness. But it also hopes to, again, establish some degree of an evidentiary bar above which only then could witchcraft persecution happen, and thus provide Puritan grand jurors with just that education for dealing with the obscurities so idiosyncratic of witch trials. And that does include a significant degree of skepticism about spectral evidence. This is evidence produced by, ghosts and dreams and in a fit of diabolism. That includes evidence by torture and signs and symptoms not vetted by a medical professional. In fact, you get a sense that the judges in the Salem case have the Guide to Grand Jurymen in one hand and kind of the depositions in the other, and they're trying to make sense of it, and they're kind of figuring out the process as they go along. Indeed, while the influence of texts like Hopkins' horrifying The Discovery of Witches may have fueled some of the early frenzy there in Salem, I'd suggest that cooler heads ultimately given over to moderate text and slower legal processes like those outlined in Grand Jurymen, those came to prevail in Salem and elsewhere and had a huge impact on the development of American jurisprudence more generally. Again, the Salem Witch Trials are so well trod over that it can feel as if everything about them has already been said. However, I hope these two questions that puzzled me when I was sitting there in the ruins of the Parris house were at least of some interest to y'all. I'm sure many of you are well versed in the dreadful events at Salem. Also, we get another obscure demonological text worth discussing in the Guide to Grand Jurymen, one which, unlike the horrible Malleus Maleficarum or the profoundly learned De Sequentitionem Magicarum of Martin Del Rio, played a massively important role because of the particulars of colonial New England, which was a grand jury system, deeply Puritan in nature, and, well, in keeping with the kind of common sense, get-to-the-point nature of the guide. And I think this had a huge impact on the development of American jurisprudence in a more overall way. If you're interested, you can actually find the Guide to Grand Jurymen in pretty nice modern reprints and in just standard reprints of the classical editions, though I don't think this text has been subject to much in the way of modern academic scholarly analysis. That'd be a great master's thesis out there for somebody. And as I mentioned, if you want to get the best book on the Salem Panic, Emerson Baker's A Storm of Witchcraft is going to be your go-to. Also, Elaine Breslaw's Tituba, the Reluctant Witch of Salem, is also incredibly worth diving into to kind of get your head around what's going on with Tituba and her life and times. And of course, the heap of primary documents related to the panic are mostly available online, both in transcriptions and in images, and something kind of, I don't know, creepy about taking a look through those documents as well. Until next time, I'm Dr. Justin Sledge, and thank you for watching Esoterica, where we explore the arcane in history, philosophy, and religion.